The morning of April 11th, 1943, began with a sound that had become all too familiar at Naval Air Station Patuxent River. The high-pitched scream of a Wright Cyclone engine pushed past its limits, followed by the sickening crack of metal meeting water at terminal velocity. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best stood on the observation tower and watched another SBD Dauntless auger straight into Chesapeake Bay. The aircraft had been in a perfect 70-degree dive. The pilot had maintained textbook form through the entire descent and then simply failed to pull out. No radio call, no erratic maneuvering, just a precise, controlled dive that continued 500 feet past the point where recovery should have begun. This was the fourth pilot Best had lost in 6 weeks, and every single one of them had died the same way. They weren't novices. They weren't making mistakes. They were following doctrine exactly as written, executing the dive-bombing technique that had won the Battle of Midway 10 months earlier, and that precision was killing them. The numbers told a disturbing story that Navy leadership could no longer ignore. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Between November 1942 and April 1943, training commands across the United States had lost 63 dive bomber pilots to what the official reports called failure to recover from dive. The phrase was deliberately vague, designed to avoid acknowledging a harder truth. The dive-bombing doctrine that had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, the technique that every naval aviator had drilled into muscle memory, was physiologically unsustainable. The human body simply couldn't handle what the Navy was asking it to do. Commander Best had been there at Midway. He'd led Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, had personally put his 1,000-pound bomb through the flight deck of the Akagi. He knew what effective dive bombing looked like, and he knew the price it extracted. During his attack run-on, Akagi, Best had experienced what pilots called grey-out, that moment when peripheral vision fades and the world shrinks to a grey tunnel. He'd felt his arms grow heavy, felt his head pressed down into his shoulders by forces his body had never evolved to handle. He'd completed the pull-out through sheer muscle memory and willpower, but for several seconds during the recovery, he couldn't have told you his own name. Now he was watching young pilots, men with perfect training records and spotless performance reviews, die trying to replicate what he and the other Midway veterans had survived. The difference, Best realized, wasn't skill. It was simple, brutal physiology. Some pilots could tolerate the G-forces of a standard pull-out. Most couldn't, and there was no way to predict who would black out and who wouldn't until they were already in the dive. The Bureau of Aeronautics had been receiving field reports about the problem since late 1942, but institutional inertia is a powerful force. Dive-bombing doctrine had been developed over more than a decade of peacetime training. The technique worked. The numbers from Midway proved it. Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 had achieved hit rates exceeding 30% against maneuvering carriers, accuracy that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Why change a proven system? Because the system was built on an assumption that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The standard dive-bombing approach, the one taught at every Navy flight school, called for pilots to initiate their attack from 14 to 16,000 feet, roll into a 70-degree dive, track the target through a telescopic sight mounted in the windscreen, and release their bombs at 2,500 feet. The pull-out would begin immediately after release, with the pilot hauling back hard on the control stick to arrest the dive before the aircraft hit the water. The entire maneuver, from pushover to wings level, took about 40 seconds. The mathematics looked sound. A 70-degree dive angle provided the near-vertical trajectory that made dive bombing so accurate. The 2,500-foot release altitude gave the pilot enough time to complete a full pull-out with a safety margin for error. The problem was in the physics of the pull-out itself, specifically what happened to the pilot's blood when an aircraft traveling at 240 knots transitioned from a 70-degree dive to level flight. The G-forces generated during that transition were measured in multiples of normal gravity. At the bottom of a typical pull-out, pilots experienced between 6 and 7 Gs, meaning everything in their body suddenly weighed 6 to 7 times its normal weight. Blood, being liquid, obeyed the laws of fluid dynamics with merciless precision. When subjected to 6 Gs, Blood flowed away from the brain and pooled in the lower body and legs. The pilot's cardiovascular system, designed to pump blood against 1 g of gravitational force, couldn't compensate fast enough. The sequence happened in seconds. First came greyout, the loss of peripheral vision as the retinas began shutting down from oxygen starvation. This occurred at around 4 Gs and gave perhaps 2 seconds of warning. Then tunnel vision, where only the center of the visual field remained functional. At 5.5 Gs, most pilots would experience complete blackout, total loss of vision while technically remaining conscious. At 6 Gs and above, consciousness itself would slip away. The brain, receiving perhaps 30% of its normal blood supply, would simply shut down. Here was the trap. The standard pullout took between 4 and 6 seconds from initiation to level flight. G-induced blackout could begin in less than 2 seconds. A pilot would start his recovery, feel the G-forces building, sense his vision beginning to narrow, and then his conscious mind would vanish precisely when he needed it, most. The control stick would go slack, the pullout would halt halfway through its arc, the aircraft would continue its dive into the water with an unconscious pilot at the controls. Even worse, when the G-forces finally released, either because the aircraft entered a terminal spiral or simply because it hit the water, consciousness would sometimes return in that final second. Pilots would regain awareness just in time to understand they were about to die, but too late to do anything about it. Flight surgeons at the Naval Medical Research Institute conducted systematic tests using the centrifuge facility at Pensacola. They subjected volunteer pilots to the exact G-force profiles measured during combat dive bombing runs. The results confirmed what the accident reports suggested. When pilots were warned that high G-forces were coming and told to perform anti-G straining, tensing their leg and abdominal muscles to trap blood in the upper body, they could maintain consciousness through pullouts that would otherwise render them unconscious. But in actual combat, during the final seconds of a dive with the target rushing up at them and every fiber of their being focused on keeping the bomb site centered, pilots forgot to strain. Their conscious minds were too task-saturated. By the time they initiated the pullout, it was too late to prepare their bodies for what was coming. The G-forces hit like a hammer, and consciousness simply switched off. The Germans had encountered this exact problem 4 years earlier during the Stuka's combat trials over Poland in 1939. Luftwaffe pilots who had performed flawlessly in training were auguring into Polish farmland with their bombs still attached. 7 aircraft lost in a single week to what investigators quickly identified as G-induced loss of consciousness during pullouts. The German solution was elegantly simple and utterly pragmatic. Engineer Hans-Ulrich Rudel, working with design teams at Junkers, developed an automatic pullout system that removed the human element entirely. The pilot would set a recovery altitude on a barometric switch before beginning his dive. When the aircraft reached that preset altitude, pneumatic actuators would automatically haul the control stick back regardless of what the pilot was doing. Even if the pilot was completely unconscious, even if he'd released his grip on the stick entirely, the aircraft would pull itself out of the dive. The system included a mechanical override, a red handle the pilot could pull to regain manual control, but that override required a conscious decision. If the pilot had blacked out, the automation would save his life without any input whatsoever. The results were immediate and dramatic. Stuka loss rates from dive accidents dropped by over 80% within 3 months of widespread deployment. Pilots reported feeling the stick wrench itself backward during pullouts they barely remembered initiating. Some described regaining consciousness in level flight, with no memory of the previous 5 seconds. The automatic pullout had an unexpected secondary benefit. It allowed pilots to hold their dives longer. Knowing that the aircraft would recover itself at a preset altitude meant pilots could keep their bomb sights on target through the final crucial seconds without worrying about initiating pullout. They could focus entirely on accuracy and trust the mechanism to save them from the consequences. When American intelligence officers examined captured Stukas in North Africa during 1941 and 42, they noted the automatic pullout system in their reports, but dismissed it as typical German over-engineering. The American aviation community had a deep cultural skepticism toward automation. Pilots were supposed to fly their aircraft, not let machines do it for them. The prevailing attitude was that properly trained aviators shouldn't need mechanical assistance to avoid blacking out. They should simply be better pilots. This attitude persisted even as the accident reports accumulated. When Navy test pilots evaluated a captured Ju-87 at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in December 1942, they characterized the automatic pull-out system as a crutch for pilots of insufficient skill, rather than a solution to a fundamental physiological problem. That assessment would cost American lives for another 8 months. The USS Yorktown's Air Group 5 had a reputation for precision. These weren't green replacements fresh from flight school. They were combat veterans who had proven themselves in the Solomon Islands campaign, men who could put a 1,000-pound bomb into a destroyer's deck from 10,000 feet. But during a routine training exercise off the Florida coast on March 22, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Chenew never pulled out of his dive. His wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, watched Chenew's Dauntless hold its angle past the release point, past the altitude where pullout should have begun, until it struck the water in a vertical impact that left almost nothing to recover. Chenew was the squadron's third fatality in 2 weeks. 5 days later, Lieutenant William Stamper initiated his dive during the same exercise. His radio stayed silent. His aircraft stayed on trajectory. Observers on Yorktown's deck watched through binoculars as Stamper's SBD held its dive through every altitude marker, waiting for the pullout that never came. The impact sent up a plume of white water visible for miles. Stamper had been Chenew's flight instructor. He'd survived the carrier battles at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. He'd logged over 300 carrier landings, and he died doing a training exercise he could have performed in his sleep, killed by the same physiological trap that had claimed his student days earlier. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Fast Carrier Task Force operations, ordered the Bureau of Aeronautics to stop treating these accidents as isolated incidents and start treating them as a systemic crisis. The investigation that followed pulled together data from every Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron operating in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The numbers were staggering. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the Navy had lost 63 dive bomber pilots to pull-out failures during training operations alone. That was more than had been lost to enemy action during the same period. Combat squadrons were reporting that 15 to 20% of pilots experienced at least partial blackout during operational dives. Several combat missions had been compromised when section leaders lost consciousness during attacks, and their wingmen had to break off to escort them to safety. The Bureau convened an emergency panel at Naval Air Station Anacostia in early April 1943 that brought together flight surgeons, aircraft designers, combat squadron leaders, and pilots who had survived blackout incidents. For 3 days, they dissected everything they thought they knew about dive bombing technique. Test pilots flew instrumented dives with medical monitoring equipment strapped to their chests, recording exactly what happened to heart rate, blood pressure, and blood oxygen levels during each phase of the dive and pullout. High-speed cameras mounted in chase aircraft captured the exact moment when pilots' heads would slump forward or their hands would release the control stick. The evidence was irrefutable. The standard dive bombing profile as taught in every Navy flight school was physiologically unsustainable. The breakthrough came from Lieutenant Commander Richard Best himself, who had started doing something that violated every principle of existing doctrine. Instead of releasing at 2,500 feet during the early phase of the pullout, Best had been experimenting with holding his dives until 1,800 feet, sometimes even 1,500 feet, and releasing the bomb while the aircraft was still nearly vertical. Then he would execute a more gradual pullout that spread the G-forces over a longer period. The technique seemed backwards according to the manual. Standard doctrine said you released early in the pullout to give yourself maximum recovery time, but Best's bombing scores during practice runs were inexplicably better than the training command averages, and he had never experienced even a greyout during hundreds of practice dives. When Best explained his technique to the Anacostia conference, The initial reaction was skepticism bordering on hostility. A commander from the Bureau of Aeronautics told him flatly that he was lying about his release altitudes because nobody could achieve consistent accuracy from below 2,000 feet. The bombsight calculations didn't account for releases that low. But Best had gun camera footage, and when the panel reviewed it, they saw something that contradicted everything they thought they understood about bombing accuracy. Best's bombs were hitting within a circular error probable of just 35 feet, substantially better than the 65-foot CEP that was considered excellent for conventional dive bombing, and the reason became clear when aerodynamicists ran the numbers. The standard technique released the bomb early in the pull-out arc, when the aircraft was transitioning through perhaps 60 degrees of dive angle. At that angle, the bomb had significant horizontal velocity that had to be calculated and corrected for. Wind effects were substantial. The bomb's trajectory was a complex parabolic curve that required the pilot to lead the target and account for multiple variables. But Best's ultra-low releases were happening when the aircraft was still nearly vertical, between 75 and 85 degrees nose down. At that angle, the bomb dropped almost straight down with minimal horizontal component. Wind effects were negligible. The trajectory was LUST, essentially a straight line from release point to impact point. It was ballistically simpler, and simplicity meant accuracy. The G-force advantage was equally significant. By holding the dive longer and then pulling out more gradually, Best was spreading the same total G load over 7 or 8 seconds instead of compressing it into 4 seconds. Peak G-forces were lower, around 4.5 Gs instead of 6 or 7, which kept him safely below the blackout threshold. More importantly, the gradual onset gave his cardiovascular system time to compensate. Blood pressure could adjust. He could maintain his anti-G straining throughout the maneuver, instead of having it overwhelmed by a sudden spike. The technique required extraordinary nerve. A pilot was diving deeper into the danger zone before beginning recovery. But the physics were irrefutable. Lower, slower pullouts were both safer and more accurate than the doctrine that was killing pilots every week. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics ran comprehensive wind tunnel tests on bomb trajectories at the Langley Research Center. When engineers applied their aerodynamic models to ultra-low altitude releases, they discovered something that should have been obvious but had been obscured by decades of doctrinal assumptions. The standard 2,500-foot release point had never been chosen for accuracy. It had been chosen for safety. It gave pilots maximum time to recover if something went wrong, but that safety margin had been calculated assuming pilots would remain fully conscious and capable throughout the pullout, an assumption that was demonstrably false. A bomb released at 2,500 feet during a pullout traveled through approximately 180 feet of horizontal displacement before impact. During that flight time, it was subject to wind drift, air density variations, and complex aerodynamic interactions. Small variations in release timing, differences of just 1/10 of a second, could translate to 15 or 20 feet of missed distance on the target. But a bomb released at 1,500 feet in a near-vertical attitude traveled perhaps 40 feet horizontally before impact. The flight time was shorter, the trajectory simpler, and the margin for error dramatically reduced. Release timing variations that would cause significant misses at higher altitudes produced negligible deviation at lower altitudes. Combat footage analysis provided empirical confirmation. The Navy had been collecting gun camera film from every combat mission since Midway, and that footage contained frame-by-frame records of thousands of bomb releases with visible impact points. When analysts went back through the film looking specifically at release altitudes and corresponding accuracy, the correlation was undeniable. Pilots who released below 2,000 feet, whether intentionally or accidentally by holding their dives too long, achieved impact patterns 40% tighter than pilots who released at the doctrinal 2,500 feet. The lowest releases, those between 1,500 and 1,800 feet, produced accuracies approaching what had previously only been achieved by slow, vulnerable glide bombing attacks. Changing doctrine was one thing. Retraining an entire combat aviation force to do the exact opposite of what they had drilled into muscle memory was something else entirely. In June 1943, the Navy established an experimental dive-bombing school at Naval Air Station Jacksonville under Commander Best's direct supervision. The curriculum was rebuilt from scratch around what they called the delayed pull-out technique, though pilots quickly started referring to it as riding the edge, or simply the late pull. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first challenge was psychological, convincing experienced pilots that flying closer to the water before recovering wasn't suicidal recklessness, but actually the safer approach required a complete reframing of everything they thought they knew about dive bombing. The training began with classroom sessions that felt more like physics lectures than flight briefings. Pilots sat through presentations on G-induced loss of consciousness, complete with charts showing blood flow patterns during high G maneuvers and graphs correlating G onset rates with blackout probability. Flight surgeons explained exactly what happened to the human visual system when the retinas were starved of oxygen. The instructors made certain every pilot understood this wasn't about courage or skill, it was about biology. The bravest, most skilled pilot in the world would still black out at 6 Gs if he pulled too hard, too fast. The goal wasn't to fight the G-forces but to manage them, to spread them out over time so the body could adapt instead of shutting down. Then came the instrument work. The new technique required pilots to trust their altimeters in situations where every instinct screamed at them to pull out immediately. Instructors had pilots practice in link trainers, primitive flight simulators, where they would run through dive profiles repeatedly while calling out their altitudes continuously, passing 3,000, holding angle, passing 2,500, holding angle, passing 2,000, sight picture steady, 1,800, initiating pullout. The verbal call-outs kept their conscious minds engaged and prevented the tunnel vision that led to altitude awareness loss. Pilots practiced until the call-outs became automatic, a verbal rhythm that would continue even under extreme stress. The actual flight training introduced the new technique in carefully graduated steps. First flights were practice dives with no bomb load, starting pullouts at 2,200 feet, just 300 feet lower than the old doctrine. Instructors flew chase and radioed continuous altitude updates. Pilots learned to recognize the visual cues that corresponded to 1,500 feet. How large the target appeared, what the horizon geometry looked like, the specific sight picture that meant now. They practiced the gradual pullout, learning to apply steady back pressure instead of yanking the stick. They practiced anti-G straining that started before the pullout and continued throughout the recovery. They learned to grunt forcefully with each breath, tensing their leg and abdominal muscles to trap blood in the upper body. By August 1943, Jacksonville was graduating pilots who could consistently release from 1,500 to 1,800 feet, with circular error probables under 40 feet and 0 G-induced incidents. The training took 3 weeks longer than the old curriculum, but the results were irrefutable. Squadrons receiving these newly trained pilots reported accuracy improvements between 35% and 50% compared to squadrons still using traditional techniques. More importantly, the training accident rate dropped to nearly zero. Pilots were still scared. Diving to 1,500 feet before pulling out required every ounce of discipline they possessed. But they weren't dying anymore. The technique worked, and now the Navy had to deploy it across every carrier air group in both oceans before the next major operation. The delayed pull-out technique received its first large-scale combat test during Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas in June 1944. Task Force 58 brought 15 fleet carriers into the Philippine Sea, and every dive bomber squadron had been retrained in the new doctrine over the preceding 8 months. On June 19th, during what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bombers faced their ultimate validation. Japanese carriers launched massive strikes that left American combat air patrol controllers overwhelmed, and the call went out for dive bombers to shift from attacking enemy ships to intercepting Japanese strike packages before they could reach the American fleet. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage led Bombing Squadron 10 from the Enterprise against a formation of Japanese carrier bombers at 12,000 feet, an altitude where dive bombing had previously been considered marginal at best. Using the delayed pull-out technique, his pilots initiated dives from high altitude, held them through the heart of the Japanese formation, and released at altitudes below 1,800 feet, while still traveling at speeds exceeding 280 knots. The bombing accuracy was devastating. Post-action analysis credited VB-10 with destroying or damaging 23 Japanese aircraft in a single pass, accuracy rates that would have been impossible with the old high-release technique. Ramage's own bomb struck a Kate torpedo bomber so precisely that the explosion scattered wreckage across a quarter-mile radius. Not a single pilot in his squadron reported even partial blackout during recovery. The numbers from the Marianas operation told the complete story. Dive bomber squadrons using the delayed pull-out technique achieved hit rates of 32% against maneuvering warships, compared to historical averages of 18 to 22% from earlier battles. During strikes against Japanese carriers on June 20th, bombs released below 1,800 feet accounted for 14 of the 18 direct hits recorded by American dive bombers. The Japanese carrier Hio took 3 bombs in rapid succession from VB-2 pilots, who all released between 1,500 and 1,800 feet, punching through the flight deck with such precision that 2 bombs entered the same elevator shaft. The carrier sank within hours, and post-war analysis of the wreckage showed impact patterns clustered within a 50-foot circle, accuracy that would have seemed impossible just 18 months earlier. Pilot survival statistics showed equally dramatic improvement. During the 6 months following implementation of delayed pull-out training, G-induced loss of consciousness incidents dropped by 91% across the carrier air groups. Combat loss rates from dive accidents fell to statistically insignificant levels, fewer than 1 pilot per 1,000 sorties compared to 15 per 1,000 during the dark days of early 1943. The technique had solved the blackout crisis completely, but it had done something more important. It had fundamentally changed what dive bombing could accomplish. The ability to release accurately from ultra-low altitudes meant that dive bombers could now attack targets that had previously required multiple squadrons. Single aircraft could achieve mission kills on destroyers. 2 plane sections could disable cruisers. By the time the Okinawa campaign began in April 1945, the delayed pullout had become so thoroughly integrated into dive bomber doctrine that young pilots arriving from training command didn't even know there had ever been a different technique. They had learned to ride their dives down to 1,500 feet from their very first training hop, and the old high-altitude releases seemed recklessly inaccurate by comparison. The final statistics from the Pacific War showed that dive bombers trained in the delayed pull-out technique sank or damaged 47% more enemy shipping per sortie than squadrons using pre-1943 methods. They did it with lower loss rates, better pilot survival, and accuracy that transformed the dive bomber from an area weapon into a precision instrument. The technique that had seemed suicidally dangerous in 1943 had become the standard by which all other bombing methods were measured. The pilots who had learned to trust physics over instinct, who had trained themselves to hold those screaming dives just a few seconds longer than every nerve in their body demanded, had rewritten the rules of naval aviation. And they had done it by learning something that seemed impossible. That flying closer to the water, diving deeper into danger before beginning recovery, was actually the safest way to survive. That sometimes the answer to a problem wasn't to pull away sooner, but to commit harder and pull away smarter. The delayed pull-out wasn't just a technical innovation, it was a complete reimagining of what dive bombing could be when human limitations were acknowledged rather than ignored, when doctrine was built around physiology rather than assuming physiology would adapt to doctrine. Commander Richard Best survived the war and retired from the Navy in 1952. He rarely spoke about his role in developing the delayed pull-out technique, preferring instead to credit the pilots who had the courage to trust the new method when everything in their training told them it was wrong. But the 63 men who died in training accidents during those 6 terrible months in early 1943 had not died in vain. Their deaths had forced the Navy to confront an uncomfortable truth about its most effective weapon, and that confrontation had saved hundreds of lives in the years that followed. The SBD Dauntless would be retired from frontline carrier service by late 1944, replaced by the more powerful Curtiss Helldiver. But Marine Corps squadrons continued flying Dauntlesses until the end of the war, and every Marine pilot who strapped into an SBD cockpit after mid-1943 was trained in the delayed pull-out technique. They dived to 1,500 feet. They released vertically. They pulled out gradually. And they came home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.